Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast, where we make sense of local politics, schools, housing, public safety, the civic issues that impact the life of a San Diego resident. We break it down so you can understand it and make educated decisions.
Everything that goes into our investigative reporting, the journalists, public records requests, the data crunching, and this very show depends on the support of people like you because we're a nonprofit news organization. Enjoy the show.
This is the Voice of San Diego on podcast. My name is Scott Lewis. I'm here with my friend Andrew Keatts.
What's up, buddy?
What's up, dude? How are you?
I'm okay.
Yeah?
Uh-huh.
And amiga Sara Libby.
What's up?
How are you?
Pretty good.
Pretty good?
Hanging in.
Yeah? We have the big cultural change in California is coming. And I still don't think people have really grasped it, really understood what's happening. But marijuana is about to be legal to get. It's been legal to have, but it's going to be legal to get.
Right.
It's big.
Which I think that sentence maybe underscores why people haven't quite adapted to this,
Right.
this sea change yet.
Yeah.
It seems like a subtle distinction.
But it's
especially if you don't have it often or want to get it.
Right.
Then it's like, wow.
Or also, it's been pretty easy to get for a while.
Right.
It's just that it's like there's a legal and a symbolic change happening, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's the legal changes that you can literally commercially go get it, not just get a recommend from a doctor. But then you can also have it. Just openly have it.
Yes.
I think these are the legal terms also.
Yeah.
Yeah. And nearly
the new municipal code just says like
Have it.
marijuana,
Just
you can have it.
So I Made It in San Diego, our show about entrepreneurs. One of the first episodes that I did with James Slatic, right? James Slatic, a medical marijuana pioneer. Crazy story of an entrepreneurial career. Started a bunch of companies, been up and down in his whole career, personal and interesting tragedies. And then 2 years ago, he was raided by drug agents and local officers. And then that case, went on, and the district attorney was forced to give back money that they had seized from him. But then right when he championed that victory, the district attorney slapped him with 15 felony charges. And just this week, those were dropped. And the whole thing settled for basically 2 misdemeanor charges.
Right.
Yeah.
And now Slatic and 4 other defendants, this is from the UT, who worked at Midwest Distribution when it was raided in January, pleaded guilty to charges of delaying or obstructing a police officer and illegal possession of marijuana. So 15 felonies went to 2 misdemeanors, and all he has to do is a year of probation and a $1,000 fine. So this guy's roller coaster life just went back up.
Yeah.
But the big news isn't that, in my opinion. Big news is what the district attorney, the new district attorney, Summer Stephan's office said. This is spokeswoman Tanya Sierra. Again, this is from the UT. And I asked the DA if she wanted to come on and talk. She says, this case is still a little going. We want to, handle some hearings, and we'll come talk. So we'll welcome Summer back to the podcast
Looking forward
studio.
to that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the quote that got my attention. This settlement takes into account the changing focus of the new district attorney administration, which allows companies to apply for a state license to legally sell marijuana. The quote's a little weird, but that first part is the interesting part. The settlement takes into account the changing focus of the new district attorney's administration. So I think what she's saying is that she's throwing out the old Bonnie DeManis.
We're backing off.
Right?
Yeah, we're going to acknowledge that this is now a legal substance.
At least under state law.
Under state law. Yeah, right. Which is, it's interesting because...
Which is the thing that they enforce.
Yeah.
And the state voters approved this 12 months ago.
Yes.
So nothing changed last week. She could have done this 6 months ago, or 3 months ago, or 8 months ago.
Well, she wasn't DA, though.
Interesting. Right.
So what she's saying is that was a Bonnie DeMantis approach.
Yeah.
And I think you made the point yesterday that we have 3 major law enforcement officials in San Diego, right?
Yeah.
Maybe 4.
Yeah.
District attorney.
Yeah.
Chief of police of San Diego, and the sheriff.
Right. And the chief of police has, in public hearings that in front of the city council, has never backed off of her position that marijuana is a very dangerous substance, that it should be illegal, and welcoming these business into our communities is very dangerous. That this courts violence and general illegality, and
Reefer
this is
madness.
bad. Yeah, this is bad.
It was coming.
This is like the first break from that unified position from the law enforcement community. The sheriff and the chief of police don't seem to have really backed off at all, but the district attorney now certainly has, which represents a real sea change.
It does, and especially when you consider, you mentioned nothing has really changed, even though voters legalized this by a pretty big margin a year ago. And in all these other smaller municipalities, we're seeing people like take steps to ban it, even though those communities also voted by pretty big margins to legalize it. So it's really interesting to see someone actually acknowledge, well, this might be what people want, and it's also within the law.
Also, to see the DA do that.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting politically because it's her sort of disarming one of the big sort of wings of criticism about her and Bonnie DeMantis' reign, and this idea that she was going to just kind of continue that. There was a lot of advocates for access to marijuana who did not like Bonnie DeMantis, and this kind of is an attempt to disarm them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what Genevieve Jones-Wright position is, who's also running for district attorney, but it's interesting that this potentially, like you said, neutralizes that as a big issue in the upcoming DA's race.
Now, we should also say, though, that we don't exactly know, maybe some people do, but there's nothing in this statement that tells us what the new focus of the district attorney's office is. We know that this settlement takes into account the new focus, but that hasn't been articulated exactly what it is. So it may not be the case that there's a tremendous shift happening, or we just don't know quite yet. We just know that that this case no longer fits into the purview of what they believe their policy is.
I think that there was no question that there was a hostility from the district attorney, and when she has that kind of power, like what she hit James Slatic with, that's going to have a chilling effect on the innovation and the just the sector itself, right?
Right.
And if that's removed, plus the permits that are now being delivered at the city of San Diego, plus the regulatory thing and the new tax that the city of San Diego is doing, it seems like a major shift.
Yeah, it does. It does seem like a major shift. I guess I'm just eager to hear a bit more about what exactly their prosecuting priorities will be.
Right, and she says she's interested in talking about it once this case is fully, closed. So we'll press her on that a little bit. There is one other point. Probably the most read story on our site this year was a piece that our freelancer Jonah Valdez did about James Slatic's lawyer, Jessica McElfresh, and she was prosecuted as part of this whole thing as well.
Yeah, you mentioned a chilling effect. I mean, that's what the legal community has really been stunned by, is the prosecution of her as an attorney working with James Slatic. And through that, who would have thought that attorney-client privilege would be this insanely pervasive issue in city politics? But that's the thing with the prosecution of this pot lawyer, is that they're trying to say all these communications she had are no longer privileged, and we can, open up all her emails and read all her documents, and that's something that's really, really shaken the legal community.
Yeah, it was basically a prosecutorial push, not only to look at her communications in this particular case, they wanted it all.
Yeah.
And since she represents a bunch of other marijuana and cannabis businesses, that there was a chilling and worrisome, wave going through that community of like, whoa. And then just a bunch of lawyers like, what are you doing? Like, this is, and that
might have been by design, right?
Yeah.
That the goal was to send a message like, even if you think you're on the legally sound side of this business, just don't get into bed with this industry.
Yeah. And lawyers have always been kind of on the edge because they have some oath or responsibility not to break the law, and this is still legal or illegal federally. And so a lot of them have been like, I don't know whether I can work with these businesses or not, and then this just slapped another, worrisome risk on top of it. Now, so to be clear, the settlement or whatever deal they're working out with the district attorney and James Slatic has not included her, and that's still going on. There's actually a hearing while we're recording this on Thursday, so we'll update you on that and just see how that gets. It seems like the momentum is to figure something out. That's still a big deal, though.
Mm-hmm.
So, and let's just clarify. Let's end with this. Slatic is one of these guys that was on the edge of this issue for a long time. He was one of these sort of pioneers trying to, like, at the same time create a business, but also establish the legality of the business, right? Try to establish that this is not a black market, but a real market. And that carried with it a tremendous amount of risk. So there's going to be all these people making a bunch of money on marijuana, and then there's going to be like these guys who kind of pioneered the legality of it, and then there's going to be just the plain people who got in trouble for slinging dope illegally. And so we're watching this whole change occur, and it's really due to guys like that sort of risking it. All right, some politics issues this week. We call it Politics Week. First up, David Alvarez. David Alvarez, city councilman, known for kind of spontaneous political decisions. You might remember he's the city councilman from the South Bay District, District 8, and he ran for mayor 2014.
Speaking of spontaneous decisions, I'll never forget that interview he gave with Dave Rowland at City Beat before he ran for mayor.
Yeah.
Where he was basically like, well, I don't really think I'm ready for that.
Yeah.
But if people want me to do it, then I guess I'll do it. And then he did run for mayor, and now like all of a sudden you have to start making a case for yourself as the best person to be the mayor.
Yeah.
After you'd already given this on-record interview being like, I don't know, can't they find someone else? But in any case, that was a long time ago. David Alvarez has come of age as a politician since then, and I think in large part because of that mayoral campaign in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. You see a lot of maybe not a lot, but some 8-1 city council decisions in which he's the only one really articulating a really progressive policy or backlash to the rest of the council.
Yeah, and has kind of consistently, not just votes, but with like incendiary memos and whatnot.
There's a lot of incendiary memos,
He
which would be a great band name.
I think also basically if the mayor wants something, Alvarez doesn't. They're like polar opposite. And I think almost artificially so. Like it's just whatever the mayor is doing, Alvarez has to be on the other side, no question.
Yeah, it does. That happens often enough that it's fair to recognize that it is the case.
So the spontaneity. So in that case, for mayor, there were some unions and labor leaders who were upset that Nathan Fletcher was kind of moving as the Democratic candidate. Remember that in 2014 after Filner went down, and 2013-14. And Alvarez was put up as this alternative. He ended up winning or came in second in the primary and went on to be the main rival to Kevin Faulconer. Lost.
Yeah.
Now, not dissimilar here. We have Alvarez has been planning to run for county supervisor in 2020.
Yeah.
And everybody knew this. He'd raised like $100,000 already for this race.
Mm-hmm.
But this week he confirmed to me that he's going to run for a seat on the board of trustees of the San Diego Community College District.
Yeah.
Which is a 4-year term, so it would be 2018 through 2022. So he's basically saying, I'm going to run for that, but I'm hoping to quit 2 years into it.
Yeah. And so
it's an interesting take for a politician that Kevin Faulconer hasn't been willing to make,
right,
as people speculate that he'll run for governor.
It is an interesting thing to say, and he gave you a quote that I didn't quite understand when I read it in the story that you and I wrote together, where he said they need somebody like the person who currently occupies that seat has been there for over 10 years. And he says what this district needs is someone like that again. And so I'm going to run, and I'm going to walk away from the seat in 2 years. And that was very confusing to me. I didn't understand what that meant. And what it seems like it means is like that person hasn't materialized yet in this cycle. And so it would be okay if I stepped into that void for 2 years, and then they can take another look around and hopefully find somebody who's going to be there for 10, 15 years, which is because this is one of these seats that doesn't have term limits. It's never really been much of a launching pad to higher elected office, really, at least not that I can think of. And so anyway, that's the way I made sense of that statement, which at first blush just didn't make sense to me.
Well, that statement then is kind of a savage put down of the other candidates in the race, right?
Absolutely.
Like including Sean Ello. I talked to him, City Heights activist, works for Mid-City Can, nonprofit.
Graduate of community college.
Well, he went there. He went to a private school after that, got a law degree too, and he's been really active trying to get people together. Another guy, Rafael Perez, he said to me yesterday he had already heard that David Alvarez had gotten the endorsement or the nod from the American Federation of Teachers, which represents all the teachers in the district and is really the power in this sort of political situation.
Yeah, not just in San Diego, just in general around the state. These community college districts don't warrant a huge amount of attention. This isn't something that anyone goes to the polls to vote for. And so the only group that has a real clear vested interest in them is AFT. And so the teachers' unions tend to wield a considerable amount of power about who gets elected in these seats. And so that endorsement is, probably going to determine who wins that race. Probably.
I find the whole thing a little bit sad, honestly. Maybe this is, I've been covering state politics for a few years now, and there's a lot going on with community colleges, actually. They're starting to offer 4-year degrees, which is a really big deal. And there's this push in California to make community college free, at least for the first year. And so to just see it treated as, well, I'm going to warm this seat and, hang out until I get what I really want, is kind of sad.
Yeah, also people, not just in San Diego or just in California, pay a lot of lip service to workforce retraining, and a lot of those services, if they were ever to materialize, would take place in community colleges.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, so it seems like what Alvarez is doing. So Alvarez personally denied to me that he'd gotten the teachers union endorsement, which seems like it might, from what Rafael Perez said about how there's no way he's doing this without their nod. It seems like just kind of a technicality that he's hanging on, but saying like, I haven't technically got the vote or whatever, but it seems like the teachers union has sort of set this or decided what it wanted to happen, which is that it wants this to be held for a couple of years by somebody that they can trust like him, and then support him in the county supervisor race.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's interesting especially because we just know that in campaigns for something like the supervisors race, they begin in earnest well before a few months before that race. So that means in a year and a half or so, we'll be right back where we are. Or just a year from now, we'll be right back talking about the next thing that Alvarez is running for, which is County Board of Supervisors.
And I think that race is going to be something.
The supervisors race?
Yeah.
Yeah, some of the names being talked about.
Yeah.
Like Hueso?
Ben Hueso is a rumored entrant into that race, who David Alvarez ran against his brother.
Felipe,
8 years ago in the city council. Obviously won. That's how he became City Councilman David Alvarez.
And so this is not parallel, but it's happening at the same time that there's a really interesting division between the Democratic Party and one of the biggest, most active unions in town, the International Brotherhood of Electric Workers, the IBEW. And so tell us what you found this week.
Well, so I obtained some emails between a the head of the local San Diego County Democratic Party and a leader at the local chapter of IBEW. And I think people often, at least conversationally, take for granted that unions in the Democratic Party are aligned, that they're part of the same movement and therefore are in lockstep. And this was an interesting example of pretty clear dissent and a real serious rift within that group. It sort of emanated from this Mickey Kasparian situation. He has been accused of sexual harassment and workplace discrimination by 3 different women. After that happened, there was some regular protests taking place outside of the Democratic Party meetings because the Democratic Party had stayed by him. And those meetings took place at IBEW's Union Hall, and IBEW never took any steps to shut down those meetings because they said, well, we believe in freedom of speech, so we're not going to get in the business of shutting down protesters. One specific incident got a little bit testy, leading to this email exchange where Jessica Hayes from the Democratic Party said to IBEW, "We're not going to hold our meetings at your union hall anymore. I can't trust, my members don't feel safe there. I can't trust that you're going to protect them." But then started devolving into some really, it comes out of nowhere, some really stereotypically anti-union rhetoric, saying, my daughter, she doesn't exactly specify what the deal is with her daughter, but she says, my daughter works on union sites, and I want your word that she won't be harmed because of this. Please don't harm my daughter. All I can do is trust that you please won't harm my daughter. It's like, what do you, like?
She's implying like thuggery, right?
Like thuggery, like union thuggery. And so IBEWs responded to this in, as you would expect, very outraged terms and said, this is the worst anti-union rhetoric, and from all places for it to come from the Democratic Party, suggests that we've got some problems here, and I think he said we're on a collision course at one point. And he also said, this isn't the only thing, and we're not the only union that has problems with you. So in any case, just this whole exchange really showed that there's a real problem between one of the most powerful unions in town and the Democratic Party, which is, together unions and the Democratic Party represent basically the political force on the left.
Yeah, so these emails were sent over the summer, right?
Yeah, this was in June.
Yeah, so perhaps, they've mended fences to some degree, but I can't, I think we should really express, you should go read Andy's story, but you should also read the emails. They are brutal, and
yes.
I don't know how else to describe them. Like, not just mentioning the thuggery, but you can just feel like the seething coming off of both of
these are not people who like each other a lot,
right?
and are happy to be working together.
I think what we're seeing in both of these stories is this profound division of Democrats, right? Which may come to dominate the local political discussion, really, is that if this city and county become more Democratic, then the divisions within that coalition will be what, people jockey over. But at the heart of this, of course, is this discussion about Mickey Kasparian, leader of the United for Food and Commercial Workers. And what is become apparent is the Democratic Party chairwoman has really aligned with him. Right?
Yes.
And that his now rivalry with IBEW, building trades, and some other unions, it has she's kind of taken his side in this, and that's at the heart of a lot of this tension within that Democratic Party, right?
Yeah, and it's worth noting that during this has been playing out behind the scenes for the last few months, and during that time, the progressive coalition in town, such as it is, hasn't struggled to win, to notch up wins. Specifically, the city council held firm together and opposed Mayor Faulkner's proposal for a special election. That's exactly the type of thing that in the past you would often see the Republicans successfully peel off 1 or 2 votes to get done what they wanted to get done. That's what they did at this time a year ago over operating agreement for Civic San Diego. That's what they were able to do over the last 2 council president votes, and they weren't able to do it this time around. So this seems very dramatic, and it doesn't seem like it's in any way been put to bed, but doesn't seem to have materialized into real tangible results yet.
All right, we're going to take a break and hear from a sponsor, but we also are going to have the ACLU senior staff attorney, Bartis Healy. He's coming in to talk about civil rights and border issues, and we're also going to have our hero and goat. We got a special goat this section, so this episode, so stay tuned for that. But first, we're going to take a break. This Voice of San Diego podcast is brought to you by Manilatos Nelson Murphy, Advertising and Public Relations. M&M is run by Tony Manilatos, Bob Nelson, and Kelly Murphy Lampkin, who bring a vast network and decades of advertising and public relations experience to businesses, nonprofits, government agencies, and campaigns. M&M bridges the gap between clients and the people whose influence matters most. M&M is a full-service agency that helps clients develop their strategy and launch cost-effective tactics. The firm specializes in public affairs PR and advertising with an emphasis on media relations, crisis communications, community outreach, coalition building, broadcast, print, direct mail, and digital advertising. Our reporters at Voice of San Diego have certainly heard a lot from Bob and Tony over the years. Tony, Bob, and Kelly are supporters of Voice of San Diego. Learn more about their firm at mnmadpr.com. Okay, our hero of the week.
So this one goes to a special unit created by the county that deals with elder abuse. And the story was, of all places, in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, which is doing a big series on elder abuse. And they have this entire story about how San Diego is actually a model for combating elder abuse and addressing it. Who knew? And so, there's a quote from somebody who runs a National Center on Elder Abuse who says, "No other county in the nation has such an aggressive, all-hands-on-deck response to elder crimes. Others wish they could replicate the model, but so far San Diego is unique." So It's a pretty cool effort that combines prosecutors and all other kinds of resources to root out abuse of elders and prosecute people. Pretty
Great.
cool.
Yes, nice to find out things like that. It's like Voice of San Diego. It's really well known around the country, sometimes more than at some country clubs. And
Exactly.
Stuff. All right, our goat of the week.
You lose! Good day, sir!
Ooh, boy, this was a fun one. So just to back up a little bit, we did a fact check a couple weeks ago about this statement from State Senator Ben Waso. He said, quote, "The County of San Diego is holding over $100 million in unspent Mental Health Services Act funds." So that was Prop 63. It was a voter-approved 1% tax on millionaires, and it was meant to bankroll mental health services. And so that money has been going to the County of San Diego. And so we wanted to see if this statement was right. Were they not spending it? And basically what Lisa Halverstep found was that there was more than $100 million. There were like $160 million, including $42 million that was set for a reserve. So there was some room to spend. Now, she talked about how there were plans to spend it. She also compared it to other places where...
Yeah, a lot of counties have these big, huge stockpiles of this same money.
Right. And so obviously the reason we're so interested in this is because the streets there's tons of people in the streets that could use some mental health help, and the homeless issue has become obviously acute in San Diego. Now, that was of all fact checks, pretty benign. We didn't hammer anybody.
It was true.
It was true, and yet the county was just overclamped, just upset that that so much attention and pain had been thrown their way. And in fact, County Supervisor Bill Horn just went off at the county Board of Supervisors meeting this week, and so we pulled a couple clips from what he was saying. So here's the start of his little just lament about how things were going.
I don't like reacting to the press. Diane, you know as well as I do, since we've been sitting on this board, we get beat up for everything we do. They look at our wallet and say, hey, you have a reserve, so we want you to spend that. And so they come up with an idea to spend it. So I just, we're always the target. We're always going to be the target. I hope whoever's sitting in these seats in a couple of years will realize that you don't need to react to these people.
These people.
There's a lot there.
Always the target. First of all, no, they're never the target. The county board of supervisors gets so little accountability, journalism, and attention that statement is just bald-faced absurd.
Also, it's they come up with this idea to spend it. Well, it was voters who came up with the idea, and then Ben Waso who brought it up.
Yeah.
So this was not something that Sarah and Lisa and Scott sat in a room and said, "Hey, we have an idea."
Yeah, and we're always the target. We're always the target. Like, oh, poor you. Somebody pointed out that this money is there, and then we did an explanatory fact check about that. Yes, it is, and this is some of the context around that. I mean, just the idea that this was an attack just shows how thin-skinned these people are, and they're always the ones that are like, "Oh, we're so tough," and we're the ones that are, everybody else. So he kept going. I pulled another part of this. Let's hear his conclusion here.
Every time we get a report, some reporter who's brand new and got a typewriter or computer, I guess, writes a story and decides to pick on us. Because guess what? We're not in the red. And so, I mean, we become the target. I just don't like us to I read the editorial sometimes, usually it's after the fact, and they're absolutely wrong. So I would just say to staff, continue to do the right thing, continue the march. These people will go away.
Okay, two things. We're not going anywhere. I'm sorry.
There's more than two things.
Yeah. There's well, okay, bunch of things. We're not going anywhere, and you're going to be gone before we are, Supervisor Bill.
We're still going to be here on our typewriters, writing our editorials, which we don't, run at Voice of San Diego.
Yeah. The second thing is, I would just say to staff, continue to do the right thing. Continue to march. Come on. It's not the valley of death you're going through here. I'm sorry that somebody called to ask some questions. I hope you guys will be okay. But yeah, also the diminutive, like they get their new typewriter and they're just typing and they think it's so.
And they're brand new.
Yeah, brand new. I'm sorry. Lisa's been doing this now in San Diego 5 years. Before that, obviously, was a veteran reporter. Get out of here with this nonsense. This martyr complex that the county sued, and this is the guy who he was asking for a raise like a decade ago. One of the many raises the county board of supervisors have given themselves, and he said, "We're not Franciscan monks. We didn't take a vow of poverty." This guy, for such a tough, farmer, I get things done. I made myself, he's the thinnest skin sensitive flower I've ever seen.
Absolutely.
Right? I'm sorry, Snowflake. Hopefully you can get through this. And with that, we're calling into this great Voice San Diego podcast. Hope everybody has a good Thanksgiving. And we'll be back next week. Okay, we're joined in the great Voice San Diego podcast studio by Bartis Fakili. He's the senior staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union in San Diego. Thank you for coming in, Bartis. I've talked to you before on the phone, but this is nice to have you here.
Yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks.
All right, so explain your role at the ACLU.
So I'm on our legal team, which means I'm part of the crew that goes into court and sues people. Most of my work focuses on immigrants' rights. I also have a juvenile justice piece to my work that involves a lot of policing issues as well.
How big is the local ACLU right now?
We're up over 30 staff.
Wow.
In terms of court litigators, we have 5 full-time staff. We also have a huge portion of our organization that does community education, know your rights presentations, and things like that.
Okay. Sarah, I'm going to ask you, can you just explain really quickly some the story we did this week on the Citizens Law Enforcement Review Board?
Yeah, so this was by Kelly Davis, who's a regular contributor of ours. And this was on the Law Enforcement Review Board, which is the kind of watchdog group that polices the police in terms of the county sheriff. So there's one that looks over the county sheriff's dealings and one that deals with the San Diego Police Department. So they did something pretty unprecedented this week, which is they dismissed 22 death cases. So these are people who died in jail or in police custody, as they were being arrested, with no investigation of what happened. And it's because they're interpreting this rule in a very strange way that deals with when you can discipline police officers. And the Police Officers Bill of Rights says, you can only take action against an officer if it's within a year of the incident. So they're saying these are all so old, we have such a big backlog that we're just not going to investigate them at all.
And so the thing with that, though, is we might still want to know what happened.
We might still want to know what happened. And aside from, disciplining the officers, there might be protocols you could put in place. There might be safety measures you could put in place. And so, can you tell me just how the ACLU is being involved in this and what you ideally would like to see happen?
Sure. So we actually sent a letter to the CLRB offering our recommendation that they not dismiss, that there's a fundamental purpose to civilian review, and particularly in their charter, that they seem to be missing the point of, which is transparency, identifying policies that have been violated or need to be changed in these use of force incidents. Discipline is one reason, but there's internal affairs to take care of those kinds of things. Really, civilian review is about establishing trust between the community and the police department, some degree of transparency. If you're the family of one of these people that have died, you want to have faith that there's an uninvolved group looking into it and can tell you what happened and give you some closure.
Yeah, so some of the cases that are part of this group of 22 are being litigated as civil lawsuits, and so we've seen some details spell out, and some of them do involve really troubling scenarios where, they perhaps missed signs that a person was suicidal, sometimes big flashing neon signs that a person was suicidal, and things like that. And so certainly those are instances in which, protocols could be put into place to protect people aside from disciplining, this specific person.
Right. I couldn't agree more that there are, when a civilian review board can see patterns like that and say, here's a policy where maybe we need to respond to these incidents where mental health is clearly at issue in a different way. And we've been advocating for that for a long time. We sent a complaint to about the way SDPD in particular, not the sheriffs, handle mental health cases and sort of excessive responses. And it comes out of the nature of policing. You need civilian review sometimes to come in from the outside and say, you might think about doing this a different way.
So if we step back a little bit, as recently as a year or two ago, groups like CLRB were in some ways being hailed as a model for a police watchdog group because they're all set up a little differently and they all have different kind of powers. And people were making a push that the group that watches over SDPD maybe needed more powers. Can you talk a little bit about, what an ideal police watchdog group should be doing and maybe what powers you think it should have?
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. Civilian review is only as good as the makeup of the agency itself, and you can have civilian review with really empty powers that doesn't really do much good. Again, going back to the purpose of civilian review, part of it is to build trust with the community. You want real transparent investigations. So you want things like subpoena power. Can the civilian oversight go in and look at documents, the same documents that IA looks at? Can the civilian review board recommend discipline is certainly something you want. And then can they air transparently their findings? Do they have the power to identify policy, not just policy violations, but policies that may not have been violated but need to be changed? So all these powers can be spelled out. And you're right that CLRB has long been one of those that has been hailed as having a lot of the facets of civilian review that you'd want to have.
Can you describe who's on this board? Okay, so it's civilians.
Yeah, so they've had a lot of turnover recently and have a new executive director, which is kind of part of why this is happening, I think, because there's been so much internal chaos that they have this huge backlog of cases and why they're interpreting rules differently now. Got
it. All right, Barnes, one of the things that you're most involved with personally, too, is immigration and immigration and customs enforcement and some of the things. And I remember when we talked several months ago, I was trying to understand particularly what was meant by the word sanctuary and stuff like that, and how it was, I feel, misused as a word, because there is no sanctuary even in so-called sanctuary places. So, but one thing that you helped me understand was that one of the main places where federal immigration enforcement interacts with local law enforcement was at the jails. There's 3 main detention centers in San Diego, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, had about 15 to 20 agents working out of those jails consistently. And now there's a new law, SB 54, that one of the impacts of that is that they can no longer be there. So I know you do most of your work with the federal detention facilities, but are the impacts of that decision and that new law starting to be seen?
So that law actually goes into effect January 1st, but certainly the sheriff has to be getting his ducks in a row as far as that goes. I've seen reporting where where Sheriff Gore has said, I'm interpreting this law to allow us to let ICE in here and there. Mm-hmm. And so some of that remains to be spelled out. But yes, you're right that in San Diego County, we're rare in that we have consistently had ICE in the jails physically. And if you take a minute to think about what that means, we have a client who went in, he was 18, he was a month out of his 18th birthday. He went in on a DUI arrest. He had one beer. He blew a 0.01, but because he's 18, he went into jail. The DA just said, I'm not going to prosecute this case. And so they let him go. But because ICE was stationed there, they picked him up right there on his way out. Otherwise, he would have gone home to his parents. This was a senior in high school. So having ICE now required to be outside the jails is really going to reduce the impact in our communities of heavy-handed immigration enforcement.
And one of the responses to that, like Senator Joel Anderson, would make the point that, okay, if they're not in the jails, then they're going to go looking for people in neighborhoods and at other places where they're less likely to encounter actual criminals, but mostly encounter people who are non-criminals. And what would you say to a reaction like that?
So it seems like an overly aggressive reaction. Well, first, it implies that they're not in our communities already, and ICE has been in communities knocking on doors already. So the idea that all of a sudden we're going to have thousands and thousands of ICE officers in our neighborhoods is false. They don't have those.
And not just under Trump. The Obama administration removed thousands and thousands of non-criminal people who hadn't committed any additional crimes when, for however they entered the country, but they hadn't committed a crime here, and yet they were still being removed.
That's absolutely true. So the difference in the administration, there's a feeling I think we see in sort of some of the cases we see that the agents feel a little more at liberty to pursue things. They're doing a lot more of what are called collateral arrests, where they'll go in after someone who has a final removal order, but they'll identify other people in the house. But in terms of big community sweeps, that's not something ICE has to do, and that's something that's really going to be something to monitor going forward.
One thing that we've kind of been keeping an eye on is, just big picture groups like the sheriff and SDPD aren't supposed to be doing immigration enforcement, but we keep seeing kind of like the veil slip a little bit. Mario Corran had a story a month or two back about, a couple was pulled over by sheriff's deputies and eventually handed over to Border Patrol. And, I feel like I see a lot of stories that are, 200-300 word stories that says, oh, they were pulled over and police stumbled upon this house full of immigrants and suddenly Border Patrol was there. Can you describe it from your perspective to what extent there is collaboration, and are they doing any sort of enforcement?
So there is some muddy water here. There's no doubt. The law, SB 54, and historical practice are that there are these task forces, joint task forces that local law enforcement and DHS get involved in together. And those task forces can target, for instance, organized drug activity or organized crime or trafficking rings, and there's various task forces that exist. Now, to what extent those exist and how many people are assigned to those things, that's still a little bit murky. And then how far outside their mandates they might go is another one that's sort of murky, right? You get people that are picked up presumably under one of these task forces that have no identifiable connection to organized crime, drugs, trafficking, anything like that.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you articulated well when we spoke several months ago was just this, if we step back and just talk about what should and shouldn't be happening in our country. And I remember asking, well, okay, so if somebody is here without authorization, shouldn't we do something about that? And I think you put it really well, that it's just the perspective that you guys have is that it's not balanced. Right. That the enforcement versus what resources are available for people who might be wrongly accused of being unauthorized, something like that.
Right.
Can you put that into words?
Yeah. So there's a couple pieces there. So one, if you take the position that there should be immigration enforcement against people that are here unlawfully, you don't have the kinds of numbers of agents to do the things that this administration and others have said to deport all 9 or 11 million people that are here. So how do you go about doing that work? And law enforcement in every sphere of our life has discretionary authority. Not every cop has to stop someone for every unlawful thing they see, every jaywalking ticket, things like that. And so ICE has that same authority. And you'd like to see that exercise with some degree of responsibility to how long someone's been in our community, how connected they are to our communities, and those kinds of things. That used to happen a lot more than now. Mm-hmm. It was never perfect, but it certainly seems to be less the case now. The other piece I'd add to that is that if someone's going to be put in that process, what we believe very strongly in is that process should be fair. Right? So maybe people have to be deported, but they should be given a fair shake at making their case to stay. And that involves, what happens now is they get detained. They're not appointed a lawyer. They have to argue their case from detention against a government lawyer in front of a judge. They're supposed to somehow get their evidence together from jail, the Immigration Detention Center. And so the chips are stacked very heavily against them from the get-go.
One of the things that I think Maya told me, or somebody else, was that that actually some of that discretion is being removed from ICE agents, that they actually have to hit everybody the same, and that there used to be a lot more explicit sort of instructions from the Obama administration about like what you prioritize, and now little, big, whatever, it's all getting the same attention. Have you noticed that?
So that happens a lot in the collateral arrests we're seeing. So the prior sort of guidance from the Obama administration was to target certain kinds of criminal activity, people that have been found guilty of certain kinds of criminal violent crimes, that kind of thing. And if you were the brother or neighbor or sister or cousin living with that person, but you were otherwise not having that kind of background, you wouldn't be at risk. And what's happening now is DHS is coming into neighborhoods. They're targeting this one person who might have a prior removal order or might have a conviction, but everybody around is at risk at that point. And they are that memo, that guidance memo, has been rescinded, and now they're free to pick up anyone that they believe is unlawful in this country, unlawfully in this country.
We've been seeing a lot of pretty troubling national stories. You do work inside detention centers about stories of women who are pregnant being detained, perhaps against policy. And even this week, BuzzFeed had a big story about women in Otay Mesa at the detention center who were sickened because they were, cleaning with these dangerous chemicals. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing, and maybe as citizens and journalists, what our concerns should be about what's going on inside these detention centers?
Sure. So San Diego and Imperial County have two very large immigration detention centers where upwards of over 700 immigrants are held in civil custody. So these are not a single person in these detention centers is there serving time for a crime. They either have no criminal background or they served their time already in a jail. So this is civil custody, the same constitutional principle that applied to internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. That's what we're talking about. The facilities are run by private corporations who have a profit motive. They're paid by the government around $140 per bed per night. The detainees do a lot of the work. So they get paid $1 a day to do the custodial work, to polish the floors, which is the incident you're talking about this past weekend when some female detainees were supposed to be polishing the floors. A lot of the chemicals spilled. The entire unit of female detainees got sickened. There were, I think, 9 pregnant detainees in there. A detainee that had a kidney transplant. That were all sickened and vomiting, and it was a mess. And that's the kind of thing that happens when you have this sort of entanglement with private for-profit entities doing this, really what should be a limited constitutional authority to do civil detention.
And how many of these facilities do we have in San Diego?
So we have one in Otay Mesa. The Core Civic, it's what used to be called CCA, is now been rebranded as Core Civic. They own their own facility. They have upwards of 800 detainees. And then in Imperial County, there's one in Calexico run by Management and Training Center, MTC.
All right. Describe this other thing that we were working on. We had some updates about recently. This was a case where DNA evidence was taken from somebody who wasn't accused of a crime. Talk about what happened.
Yeah, so they were accused of a crime, but
Okay.
it was eventually thrown out by a judge. But this was a group of young people in southeastern San Diego who were stopped by police, and they contend, for being young minorities who deign to walk in a park or whatever. And they had their DNA swab taken by police, which you're supposed to only do, under a limited set of circumstances and with police permission. And so their cases were thrown out, and a judge did say, yes, their rights appear to have been violated. And so now they're suing SDPD for that violation of rights. And the update that Kelly wrote about recently was that one of the people involved in this case was recently put into California's gang database immediately after suing SDPD. And so his mother and his family are troubled by the timing of that. And say, it was retaliatory. And we've done a lot of reporting on California's gang database, and some new reforms have just been passed by Shirley Weber from San Diego. And so I'm just interested to see your perspective on what you think of those reforms and whether you think other reforms that have passed in the last couple of years are being implemented properly, and whether you still have concerns.
So yeah, that's actually our case, and there's 2 things to touch on there. The San Diego Police Department's written policy that says they can go out and get kids' DNA based on their own consent. That's at issue here, which is a sort of a sidestep of state laws that cover how that's handled on a state level. And then there's the issue of the gang databases, which I think also is another example of these sort of ways that law enforcement is surveilling communities of color. The reforms are certainly good. It used to be that you could be put on the gang database, and everyone in that community knows if you're on the gang database, you're going to get stopped more often. You're going to get asked questions a lot more often. Just going to school or work becomes a hassle. They never had to used to tell you that you were on the database. And there was no way to sort of contest that it was properly done. And the criteria for being put on the gang database are completely vague. So
it's a really wide set of criteria.
Really wide.
You have to meet 2 to 3 of, be seen in a gang neighborhood, which if you live there, it's pretty easy to be seen there. Be seen with other people who are members of the database. So if one of them's your brother and you live in the neighborhood, there's 2 right there.
Right. Gang color, gang dress. So if you're wearing a white shirt with blue sleeves like our client was, there's number 3. So these are incredibly troubling criteria for getting listed. And it is true that just by living in certain neighborhoods, you can find yourself in the database. And there was an audit of the database, and they found, people with dates of birth that would have made them infants in the database.
The gangster babies.
Yeah, the gangster babies.
Yeah. One really sad detail from Kelly's story about this that I thought was just remarkable is that the mother of this young man at the center of the case takes photos of him when he goes to the park to play basketball or whatever to show what he was wearing that day, to show he wasn't wearing, gang colors. He was wearing like a Looney Tunes t-shirt or whatever. And just the fact that that's happening in one of our neighborhoods and that parents go to those lengths to protect their kids, I think is really remarkable and something that people in a lot of neighborhoods in San Diego don't have to deal with at all.
Yeah, no, I tell her constantly she's one of my heroes. She is absolutely trying to raise her children in a very difficult set of circumstances, making sure they understand their rights in a place where she knows that they're going to encounter police by, even if they do everything the right way, they're going to have encounters with police. And it's a really difficult set of circumstances.
Now, just the specifics of this case. So I never quite understood. They were in a park, but I did understand. I just need to refresh. They were in a park. There was a gun found. Now, what was the situation with the gun? Yeah,
so I think one of them had an unloaded gun in a backpack that belonged to a family member, and that was kind of the basis for being able to bring them in. But the
judge said that they shouldn't have ever been.
They should never have been stopped to begin with, and so I think it was the basis for the stop that led to that eventual discovery of the gun is what got them in trouble.
Yeah, it was an unloaded gun lawfully registered to one of the boys' fathers. Okay. So these are 15 and 16-year-old kids, and listeners can say what they want about whether it was appropriate for a kid to take his father's unloaded gun, and that's a problem. But these 5 boys were just walking through a park, and they got stopped for walking through a park that the police say is a gang park. But this is Memorial Park. We had our press conference when we filed the case there. It's a nice park. There's a rec center. There's a Boys and Girls Club there. If it's a gang area, then everybody going to and from that Boys and Girls Club ticks off one of the boxes for being a gang member. If they wear blue that day or red, then that's 2, and they're in. So the justification for the stop was that they were walking through. The other justification was that it was on a particular day that they said was a day that was a gang holiday. But we've seen filings where the gang holiday moves around. It's often used as a justification. Easter was once used as a justification for being a gang holiday. They saw a lot of people in a park having a picnic, and they thought that was a gang gathering on Easter Sunday. So really questionable use of enforcement tactics to counter these kids in the first place.
So obviously this has been a big year for the ACLU. The National, at least, has taken a pretty vocal stand against a lot of President Trump's, rhetoric and things. What has it been like? What has your experience there been like? Have you seen a ton of more resources come? Has it been way too intense with all the issues you have to deal with? What's the year been like?
So in some ways, it's a lot of the same, but then there's sort of double the volume, right? So a lot more. One, you have a lot more people that are paying attention to things that are troubling around them, and so those intakes come in. There's a lot more coming out at a federal level of changing tactics and policies you have to keep up with and pay attention to. So particularly in the beginning of the year, not a lot of us were getting a lot of sleep. All of our families deserve a pat on the back for allowing us to get our work done. As the year's gone on, we've sort of found where our best roles are sort of between the affiliates. We're in 50 states and we have a national office, right? So trying to figure out where everyone's role was a challenge in these changing times, but we're getting into stride. We've been fortunate enough to be able to add some resources in terms of staff to help with some of the stuff.
I ask you about that. So it not only was this Trump stuff happening, but then there's also been this wave for the last few years of social and criminal justice issues. And in particular, the Black Lives Matter movement and other things. And one thing that's always sort of surprised me, and I just want to ask you, like your area and coalitions of support that you have,
mm-hmm.
I actually have been surprised that there's not been more principled conservative support for the kind of criminal justice reform movement that's out there. Because when you think about like the government, being too powerful or too big, there could be literally no more tangible impact of that than custody of, you take somebody's life or you take their freedom, or you take their property, or you take or they die in custody, there could be no possible more impactful effect of government in people's lives than that. And I don't know why. It seems like a natural sort of bridge for them to some of the communities they've had trouble mobilizing. Have you seen some come out in support of your efforts, more or less, or anything like that?
On some things, certainly, they're on bail reform and sort of things that involve fiscal responsibility. You see agreement on both sides that there's a better way to do things. When I look at ICE detention and the fact that we pay, $160 a night per person per night to private corporations, I think that's another thing where we could potentially get that kind of support. We all need to do a better job, I think, of reaching out and talking to people that lean in a more sort of traditionally libertarian conservative way and explaining what we see troubling in our government. Whenever I have those one-on-one conversations, we all sort of see eye to eye, but it's hard in these times, I think, to get those conversations going.
I was going to say the one thing I can think of is actually civil asset forfeiture.
Right.
And so the taking of money seems to bother a lot of politicians, as opposed to taking, somebody's liberty or life. And one thing that's also come up here that I have seen more Republicans pay attention to is deportations of military veterans. That seems like a community that they're, sympathetic enough to, that they understand that there are issues there.
Yeah. And so, the hope is that if you can see that issue, then you can help then take them the next step to seeing other communities and immigrant communities that way.
Well, Bartis McKeely, one of the senior staff attorneys at the ACLU San Diego, thank you so much for taking the time.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
The Voice of San Diego podcast is part of the Voice of San Diego podcast network. Visit voiceofsandiego.org/podcast to learn more about the Cura Chaos show about movers and shakers on both sides of the border, Beer Talk Radio, our business shows Startup Vault and I Made It in San Diego, and the rest of the shows in the network. If you like the show, go to voiceofsandiego.org and click the donate button. Or if you'd like to sponsor it, contact me at kinsey@vosd.org. That's KINSEE@vosd.org.